Hello and welcome to Pale Reflections, a proud member of the Doof Network where we reflect on Wildbow's most self-aware and trim work as it releases. I'm Ruben Morehouse.
And I'm Elliot Diebold.
And we are back from being away to talk about Back Away 5.D, the ending of Back Away, as well as the start of a new arc, Cutting Class, which begins with the trio in class, very much not cutting it, 6.1. But we'll get to that. Let's start with Back Away 5.D, where we get a number of perspectives from a number of different others, starting with the perspective of a true hero, Snotty Boo, who is being persecuted for the power of his art, like a modern Galileo, but is saved by Toadswallow arriving on the scene to offer these new goblins a very special deal.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I was like ecstatic when I found out we were getting a bit of a goblin point of view.
Yes.
And like it opens with him like dragging his ragged fingernails along the inside of his nasal cavity, which even just saying that now for like the 10th time sends shivers down my spine. It's such a perfectly disgusting opener for a goblin perspective.
Yeah, it's suitably goblin, isn't it?
Yeah.
From the get-go, oh, it's goblins immediately. Which is great, of course, because goblins are the best characters in in Pale.
Yeah, I just find them so fun. But on that note, before we talk about like Toadswallow's whole thing, I really want to talk about our little point of view guy, Snotty Boo. Maybe he's unclear on if that's his name yet or not. Just because like for a goblin, he's surprisingly innocent or like non-violent. Like he's having lots of violence done to him, but he's not a particularly violent goblin.
No, he seems quite passive, right?
Yeah, he climbs up on. I mean, all the other names are sort of blurring together in my head. It's like Bumnack or something. And does a bit of violence there, but for the most part, like he's not a violent goblin.
Well, yeah, I guess he does suffocate this other goblin by sealing off his breathing passages, which is pretty rough.
But that's
But you're
like
right.
it's a it's a very passive kill.
Yeah, sure. It's a nice chill kill. No, you're right. He's. I mean, maybe because it's minor, he doesn't seem especially, eager to enact random acts of violence.
Yeah, like Toadswallow is usually the one getting him to do this stuff. And like it almost feels like some sort of initiation ritual for like some sort of mob or gang or something where it's like you've got to get a kill to get in. And you can sort of see like, dude, maybe a lot of the goblins start off not quite this gross, and it's like that's just how you move up the goblin totem pole. Because I remember from our thing on the goblin names, I think they get more violent as they get bigger. And it's all about like having a claim, like it was so and so who did the 1,000 so and so's or something.
Yeah, I mean, it makes me think of, and we see this in kind of in Mrs. Spoilers, I guess, in Mrs. Interlude later on as well, where we're like, it gives me this vibe of like, the more you go down your path, the more you become that thing, right?
Exactly.
So Snotty Boo is much closer to being just a neutrally kind of spirit of mucus than he is to being a goblin, let's say. But the more he goes down that path, obviously, the more goblin-y he'll become.
Yeah, and it's just because the established goblinism is kind of violence.
Yeah,
And I mean,
totally.
that's true in real life as well. Like we're very, as people, so much of your personality depends on like how and where you grew up. Like there's other things to it, but like
Yeah.
you can get suckered into shitty cultures if you grow up in them. And is that what's happening to Snotty Boo here?
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. I guess that's then the ultimate question, the ultimate extension of that question is, if let's say there's a big wheel, right? And right in the middle is a neutral spirit, and you can go down any of the spokes on that wheel to become a goblin or a fae or a lost or whatever. Are humans on that wheel, or is there a different dimension to humanity? How does humanity tie into this great wheel of others?
I'd put them outside of it, but I can't think of a way to integrate my thought into the wheel metaphor. I don't know if that's sort of capturing it. I see because we've seen so many others are from or of humanity. Like there is humanity in all of them, so it's more of this complex web rather than a wheel, I suppose I'd
Mm.
say. Yeah, I don't know.
Yes, fair enough. That probably is a bit of a simplification. The core thing I guess I want to interrogate is, I mean, we'll get to this more later, I suppose, but the idea of humans are up here, and then animals are down there, and then below even animals is others, and they're their own separate thing. I mean, yeah, the real thing that this story has repeatedly told us about is these labels are so arbitrary. And it's weird that that's
Yeah.
something that practitioners inherently understand as don't rely too much on a label, but seem to, at the same time, very much rely on labels.
Yeah, well, I mean, this world in a way kind of conditions you to want to label things
Yeah.
because of the way patterns are established in this world and reinforced by the universe, by the spirits. It,
Yeah.
it kind of encourages you to say, "Oh, that's a pattern. Everybody notice this is a pattern," and kind of start to make that more true.
Yeah,
Um,
and the more energy and thought you invest into a pattern, the more true it becomes, right?
yeah,
So to an extent, reaffirming a label is what gives it its power.
and I mean that's what I love about this world so much because that is how the human brain works. Like
Yes.
um the human brain is always desperate to sort of find and identify patterns and kind of make them up as a thing. That's where most superstitions come from. This is just a world
Mm,
where it's like that actually is true. Like
mm.
the way humans sort of join dots that don't really exist and say, hey, that's how it works. That's actually kind of seems to be like actually what happens in the pack or in the pale universe.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Should we? We've gone off. I mean, that's what these chapters are probably going to be a lot about because it's very much. In fact, this first chapter is probably the least theoretical of all the ones that we're going to talk about.
Yeah.
It gets a lot into the concepts of the world, so I think that's what a lot of this
Yeah.
episode is going to be.
We're going to come back to this conversation a bunch today.
Yes,
But yeah, I
but
suppose
let's.
to go back down
Yeah.
to Earth for a bit. Yeah, so obviously Toadslow shows up and he lists 7 rules that you need to follow to. I mean, I want to say to join Kennet, but it's not like he's giving them a choice. Um,
Mm,
yeah, I don't know. There's so much to talk about here. Like I want to start with obviously when Blunt Munch shows up at the end, we learn that there's actually only 5 rules. Toad Swallow like made up 6 and 7, and Blunt Munch seemingly isn't in on that. Which is like a whole thing. Very suspicious. I really love it.
yeah. Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there, right? I guess let's go from simplest to most complex. So first, Munch comes in for this later bit and doesn't mention the extra 2 fight club rules, which I had the same take as you at first and thought, well, why isn't Blunt Munch in on them? This is this is something that's Toad Swallow specific and not Goblin specific? But maybe there's another read, which is just he's not like munches in on them and not trying to recruit these goblins with these additional rules. I don't know.
I don't know why that would be the case if it is just
Mm,
the two of them. Like, yeah,
mm.
to me, I feel like it has to be that Toad Swallow and
It's
Munch,
just Toad Swallow.
yeah, like aren't totally on the same page.
Yeah,
Um,
interesting.
yeah,
Which
we,
inherently means Toad Swallow doesn't think that if it comes down to this fight, Toad Swallow doesn't necessarily think Munch will be on the same side as him. Is that right?
I mean, it could be. Like the other thing is we've seen how selfish goblins are. It could
Yeah,
just be that, like, Toad Swallow doesn't want to share. These are
yeah.
his minimum wage workers in his business, and
Mm,
he's not gonna share them with Blunt Munch, or just with anyone. Like
mm.
he just wants people on his side, not their side.
Mm, yeah, true. It's not necessarily, as insidious as it could be, I guess.
Yeah, he doesn't want a
Um,
co-CEO.
yeah. Should we talk about the missing third rule?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Because this is really well hidden in the text because the second rule also isn't sort of called out specifically. Like, Toadstool sort of goes like, first point of order, and says that, and then we get some more text, and then it sort of skips to fourth, and you scroll up and you say, oh, there's another one there. I must have just missed the third or whatever. But like, if you look really closely, we don't see it listed from Snotty Boo's perspective.
Yes.
And yeah,
Yeah.
I'm assuming there is one thing that's listed, which we can sort of assume is the second, or it could even be the third, I guess. But it's like it's
Which
only
is
one
no
of
bringing in outsiders, that I might say so, yes.
yeah. So it's not called out as one of the terms, but like it would have to be one, and we just don't know if it's number 2 or number 3. But one of them's missing. So that's
Yeah, weird.
interesting because like
But the
you
rest of them are so exactly what we would expect that
yeah.
I find it hard to believe there's any secret. Like the secret third rule is, and we're going to kill the Kennedys or whatever, you know?
Well, yeah, but then why hide it? Like I kind of feel like it has to be something because otherwise I don't understand why Wildbow might have like left it out. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, because you're right. Like the 4 we get is basically you can't go wild in the town. You can't bring in outsiders. You got to give them power, and you got to work the perimeter. Which like all 4 of those, I was like, yeah, I mean, sure. So I feel like this missing one must be our clue for understanding Mrs. Plan or understanding what Kennett is. I don't know. Yeah,
Maybe.
it must be something.
I don't know. I don't know if I'm necessarily sold on the fact that it's something versus just being cut for. I don't. Well, if it was just cut for story expediency, why are there 5 rules? You're right. It must be something.
Yeah. I have a bit of a theory about Kennett. So, well, but I'll talk about that when Miss is on screen. Or she's never really on.
She can't be.
But yeah. So then, like, obviously, Toadslow's whole framing around his 7th rule is there's a fight coming, and you know, he wants people on his side. He doesn't care about the 2 major sides. He just needs people on his side. And so there's ambiguity as to what this fight is. Is it a Kennett civil war? Is it like Kennett versus the Blue Heron Institute or practitioners in general or whatever? Like, yeah, I can't decide which of those I think it is.
Yeah, I suspect. Yeah, it's an interesting question. Is there something more going on here? I kind of had the read of like, there's a way we could just say, well, we know that there's conflict coming because of the Blue Heron Institute stuff and the Carmine Beast stuff that's obviously going to go down, like the murder are going to come up. That's obviously going to cause conflict. But the way that Toadswallow says, and there's going to be clearly 2 sides and you're going to be on my side, like, that doesn't quite track, right? Like, it tracks with the Blue Heron stuff, I guess. It doesn't track with the idea that the murderers are going to suddenly reveal themselves and there's going to be bloodshed, because who's going to be on their side in that circumstance?
Well, you know, if there are 3 or 4 people in a conspiracy to have done this murder, that is sort of half of the core of the town. So that is enough to sort of be a Kennett civil war. Like if it was like Matthew, Edith, Charles, and you know someone else, sort of or like Marisica on a team together, then you know those 4 sort of versus everyone else would probably be enough to be like a clusterfuck.
Yeah, but you know, we've seen and we see more of that. Even though Matthew is theoretically suspicious, he's not going to be a villain, right? Like the way that he's acted in consistently and in these chapters indicates, even if he is involved, which he possibly even probably is, it's not he's a villain trying to take over as Carmine Beast for his own selfish gains, right? There's clearly more depth to it going on, and that makes me feel like it's unlikely that we're going to get into a, you know, it's Matthew and Edith versus the rest kind of thing.
Yeah. Although the thing about these sorts of fights is they can kind of drag people onto sides.
True.
Like, just because when the fighting starts, you kind of have to plant your flag on one side or the other because you can't stop the fighting. I don't know.
Yeah, maybe that's why Toadswallow thinks that there's sides are gonna break out and he's so uncertain, is because it's not a war where there's a right and a wrong side. It's a war that he sees breaking out where it's just gonna be messy and he needs all the, you know, certain backup he can get, I guess.
And that, like, knowing Toadslow, he may have specified you have to be on his side because he may not have picked his yet. Like, he very much strikes me as the sort of person who, like, wants to hitch his horse to the winning wagon. Like, you know, he's going to sort of stay on the sidelines-ish and then be on the team that he sees is winning and just, like, go with them.
Yeah. Yeah, true. So whichever side he picks, he wants people on his side.
Yeah, whoever gives him a better deal. Like,
Yeah.
And if he's got a little army of snot goblins to, you know, make himself even more valuable to the side that wins. Yeah. It's just
Um,
good war profiteering business.
yeah, fair enough. It's hard to, you know, it's you could maybe see this as being manipulative and villainous of Toad Swallow, but it's hard to not be like, you know what, fair enough, Toad Swallow. You know?
I mean, I yeah. It depends where all the chips fall down when we
Yeah.
figure out who did it and whatnot.
Yeah, this definitely isn't enough for me to be like, oh, Toad Swallow's plotting something. It more just feels like Toad Swallow's being the crafty businessman that we know him to be.
Yeah, I still see him as like the gross capitalism goblin. So it's like
Mm,
looking out for himself just feels totally on brand for me.
yeah. Should we talk about Matthew's chapter,
Yeah.
section, whatever?
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, we go into Matthew's perspective. He and Edith have met with Zed for a power drop off as the first part of this chapter.
Yeah, so I mean I guess R.I.P. Yolda.
Mm-hmm.
She has been stripped and divided into parts.
Yay!
We did it.
Two thumbs up.
Yeah, there's some very interesting interactions in this that really lead into our extra material this week, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What's your read on this breakdown for power? I mean, Yolda is an interesting character because she kind of went too far, right? Clearly,
Well,
was too far gone to be saved in any way. But now it does feel like she's been broken down and turned into a literal material good, which also doesn't feel great.
I mean, I just see her as like just a victim all the way. First of all, like her initial existence was as a manifestation of like suffering children.
Mm,
So already shitty deal. Then she gets hunted alongside John and the squad for ages. They finally make it and settle down in Cannet, where her
mm,
sickness forces the one friend she has, John, to have to kill her. Where she gets buried, and then somebody else dug her up, turned her into this horrifying thing that had to kill people. And
mm.
then she, now she's been chopped up into pieces. Like, honestly, this might be a mercy killing. Like at this point, like she just keeps drawing very short straws for how to exist.
Sure, a mercy killing, but also she hasn't just been killed, she's been killed and turned into tools, right?
Yeah, but I mean, that's what she was already as the Hungry Choir. Like,
True.
she was crafted into that and used as a murder
Yeah.
weapon. Like, this is not arguably better because, like, I think the thing that jumped out to me is when they're sort of giving her when they're giving when Zed's giving Matthew and Edith the Hungry Choir battery. Like the Hungry Choir, I assume isn't really generating power in the same way it used to. Like since the ritual is presumably kind of stopped or at least
Mm,
slowed down.
mm.
This is much more of a battery than like a rechargeable power source. Like the Hungry Choir before was something that kept gathering power and like would
Yes.
renew it if you spent it. Now this
Yeah.
is a one-time use battery that they've been given is my interpretation.
Yeah, or at least something that's if it does recharge power on a much less scale because it's not an autonomous system anymore.
Yeah, and that's like arguably better than forcing Yolda to stay as the Hungry Choir and
Fair
constantly
enough.
kill people to gather power.
Yep, yep. That's fair enough, I suppose. Yeah. Um, something else that's worth touching on here is how just the sheer amount of times that Zed puts his foot in his mouth in this conversation. I mean, come on, Zed.
He's a bit clueless, isn't he? In this,
Yeah,
like, he is very tired. So I suppose that's a bit of an excuse, but yeah.
sure.
He-
Yeah, the my favorite one is when he mentions, "Oh yeah, they were really excited to get back for the binding class," and Edith goes,
oh. Yeah.
hmm."
Matthew has to sort of
Good
put a
stuff.
hand on her shoulder, like it's okay. Um,
Yeah.
I my favorite bit is like the first time Zed sort of yawns and Edith gets a bit ticked off by it, and Matthew has to think to himself like Zed being cavalier enough to yawn when their lives and everything they'd built were all at stake was not Zed's fault. And like I think that's such a perfect encapsulation of just what's going on here. Like Zed just doesn't, yeah, he's just a bit clueless. He doesn't get it.
Mm,
Everything Matthew and Edith are sort of saying are like, this power you're giving us, like, it actually just isn't enough. And Zed is just sort of cut, like, whenever they sort of say that, he's like, hey, this is what we agreed to. Like, he's just worried about the deal. He's not actually listening to what they're saying. Like, he's sort of too far in his own perspective. Um,
mm.
like, Matthew even has that moment where he's like, I'm glad Bree didn't come, because like I think I'm at the point where I'd seriously consider killing her to get the hungry choir back. Like that's how bad it is. Which is just like shit. Like that's
Yeah, pretty rough.
yeah.
Yeah, things are bad. This is a question that I had that I'm not sure if you raise at any later point, but it doesn't feel like there's a better point to talk about it. How do you think the Kennet others feel about the Kennetiers going back to school in the midst of this? Because we touched on this, I was pretty firmly of the opinion that it seemed unlikely they were just going to go back to school and everything be fine. And I'm still not sure that everything's going to just be fine, but clearly they've gone back to school with seemingly the blessing of the Kennet others. Does that track to you?
It hadn't crossed my mind.
Mm.
It, I don't know. Like for in cases like Edith still just doesn't seem comfortable with the Kennetiers. So I
Mm.
could see someone like Edith just wanting them gone now that things are back at the point where they can manage it, in theory.
Mm.
It kind of does feel like a bit of a dereliction of duty, though.
Mm. Yeah, I agree. Things are bad, right?
I mean, they're not
I don't
great.
know. I don't
They're
know.
definitely better than they were in Arc 5, but like, yeah. I think there's sort of this, it's like, this is like this first wave, and they're kind of putting that down. Like they've got the hungry battery, which they can use to like kind of resurrect the barrier for a little bit and like get things under control, but they're vulnerable, right? Like it's almost not that then Kennetiers are needed right now. They're going to be needed kind of constantly, because the town is just more vulnerable than it has been, and will stay that way.
Mm. Mm. Yeah. I wonder. I mean, we see. Well, I guess we're jumping around a bit, but it's hard not to in this kind of thing.
Yeah.
One of the ones we see in a bit is quite a short one with Alpi and Marisica, and they're recruiting. Right, fair enough. I wonder if we're going to see a settlement on some kind of new normal of, oh, we've got some more others, and we've got the power from from Bree, and that's kind of helping keep up the small things with our new recruits, so we can deal with the bigger things. Like, is that going to be the new normal, or are we at the point, similar to maybe a certain point in Worm, where you start to think, okay, there is no new normal that we're getting to?
I could see like a really interesting sort of angle in all this being if we spend all of Arc 6 at the Blue Heron Institute, and that takes place over a couple of weeks or something, and then the Kennetiers go back to Canada again, and it's just
Mm,
completely different.
mm,
That could be like a really fun dynamic to sort of explore.
mm. Yeah, yeah. We'll
But
have to see, I guess, where we settle.
yeah, exactly. Um, just to go back to this Matthew section though, like, and you already sort of touched on this, but how much more do you trust Matthew now after his little section here? Like,
Yeah.
he is like calling the Kennetiers like actually good people. Um, he he has that moment where Edith's like, they're keeping things from us, and he's like, yeah, but I mean, so are we, right? Like I don't know. I remain undecided on how entangled he and Edith are in this whole mess, but at least Matthew is a well-meaning villain, if he is the villain.
Mm. Yeah. I if it's seeming increasingly likely that it's Matthew at the center of this conspiracy, and also increasingly likely that that's not the end of the story. The end of the story was set up maybe as there's somebody here that killed the Carmine Beast in a bid for power. It's seeming increasingly likely that the person who killed the Carmine Beast was Matthew, and that's not going to be why. you know. Um,
Yeah, like I could almost see this being the sort of story where it's like the murderer isn't even, or like the murder doesn't end up being the point, if that makes sense. Like, or yeah, I don't know.
mm.
Like we'll learn about who did it, and that just won't even be the concern anymore, because there'll be all the stuff around why.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I'm excited to find it out.
Yeah.
We also see Matthew deciding to handle some others who have shown up looking for a fight, and we finally see him release the beast.
Yeah, and I think it's funny because I definitely kind of assumed when we first met these four that they were going to join Kennet, right? Because we know they're in recruitment mode, and
Mm,
then we saw goblins recruiting goblins, so now we see Matthew with like talking to four people who are sort of vessels or hosts or whatever, and I'm like,
yeah,
oh, okay, they're going to join.
yeah, more teammates.
Yeah,
And he tries, in fairness. He gives it a
Does he
shot.
though? He like barely. He's sort
Oh,
of
they
like,
say, oh, no, we're not interested. We're just going to raid and take things. And I think at that point, Matthew's like, okay, not going to work out.
yeah, but his sort of argument, like, I don't know, fairly early on is like, don't be stupid, which is just like, I'm not a recruiter, but like, but I don't know, he went hostile back at them very quickly. Like, yeah, I don't know.
Mm.
I guess it was kind of doomed from the looks of it. Um,
Mm.
I get it, doomed. That was on purpose. Um,
Good work.
yeah. So yeah, I don't know. To me, it jumped out to me though. It's just like Matthew just seemed to give up on the idea of recruiting them very quickly.
Mm. I don't know. These folks seem suitably creepy. And the way that, I mean, like, they attack him, right?
Oh no,
I'm
when he
not.
starts calling the Doom out, actually, he does technically start it.
Oh, okay. Fair enough. He starts calling for the Doom before they attack.
Yeah,
And
which
I'm sure they could detect that that's,
yeah,
an offensive move. Maybe you're right. So yeah, well, actually, before we get to the fight with the Doom, there's a discussion about how these others were created, right? Like the idea of somebody explicitly pushing spirits into, vestiges or failed practitioners or in some way to create these things. Do we think that this is just a random bit of exposition about these others, or do we think that the fact that there have been others created and kind of put on the path to Kennet is important? Is there something to it?
I I just saw it as establishing them as victims. Like I didn't read into, oh, somebody created these four specifically for this. I kind of got the
Mm,
impression the four of them are runaways who have been like, living on the move for a while.
mm,
Um,
mm,
so they're just sort of like murder hobos, basically.
mm,
And their victims, like they were made incomplete like this and possessed in this way.
mm. Yeah, yeah. Maybe you're right. Maybe it's just to show the thought of Matthew. I don't know, putting them down without prejudice. So yeah, Matthew lets out the Doom. It's pretty rough. It takes about 20 seconds to take out these characters who don't seem weak, right? Like
No.
they seem solid. Takes about 20 seconds to murder them, and then has the remaining 1 minute and 40 seconds to hunt down Edith.
Oh boy. I
Mm,
mean, yeah, like we knew this thing was powerful, but like holy shit, seeing it in action, it's so much more than I expected.
mm,
I like part of me was almost just like, okay, how did this thing get so massive? Like how like it's is it too powerful? I got tinfoily for a bit, but I've just sort of realized if you think about like if this thing sort of symbolizes a bit of a depression, and you think about how big depression is in your life,
mm,
when you are really depressed, like kind of makes sense that if this thing is a manifestation of that, it would be this powerful, I suppose.
mm,
Like if this is a world built on perceptions and impressions and stuff, like depression has such a massive impact on how you perceive everything about the world. It would be a very powerful force.
mm. Yeah, it's weird that it's so powerful, right? I don't know. It just is. Do we have like do we have enough information on Edith James to put together a theory on why it's like this, or is it like the fact that the girl, what was the girl by candlelight? Is that what it's called?
Yeah.
Took over and prevented Edith's death. Maybe means that the Doom is more powerful over time, or something like that. Like the
Yeah,
fact that it was
it could be
staved off.
growing, like
Yeah.
and so maybe it wasn't as big when Matthew first took it on. Yeah, I mean, who knows? It could have been growing, could have been Carmine fueled. That's some fun tinfoil. I think I've seen other people talking about, but yeah, I mean, what also really struck me in this part is how much the Doom has just infected every aspect of Matthew's life. Like
Mm,
his sight is sort of filtered through it, or it's not even his sight. He calls it the Doom's sight,
mm,
which is actually just a great metaphor for sort of the way depression changes how you view the world. Um, but
mm.
like, but also just like, yeah, I don't know. I guess it was having more and more of an impact on just how he lives every second of his life than I'd really realized. And again, looking at it as a depression metaphor, that's fucking stupid in retrospect, because of course that's what it's like.
Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah, it's interesting. What is there a part of the metaphor then to him? I don't know, unleashing it. what is that? What's the extension of the metaphor to him getting the monkey off of his back in that way?
I don't know enough to be confident. Like maybe something
Fair
about
enough.
lashing out, and
Mm.
like taking it out on other people. I don't
Yeah, I can't. I also don't feel like I know enough to have an answer to that. Should we talk about the way that the Doom fights? It's this weird kind of Rube Goldberg-y kind of way of like. I mean, it makes sense. Impending doom isn't an active thing. It's a something bad is going to happen to you of indiscriminate kind of universal karmic weight. And so the way it fights isn't by cutting you up or whatever. It's by it's going to have a tree branch fall on you and impale you if possible. I like it. It's cool.
Yeah, again, it's one of those details Walbo thinks of that there's just that extra level of thought that when you see it, you're like, oh, that's like neat, but I wouldn't have thought of it.
Mm,
Because yeah, you're right. Like it doesn't kill people directly; it puts them on trajectories so that they die. Which, like again, just sort of is a bit of a metaphor for how depression hurts you. Like it doesn't, it doesn't physically hurt you. It just sort of puts you in a bad place and sends you in bad directions.
yeah. Yeah, exactly. You know what that makes me think as well? It kind of triggered this thought in me of like, we know that at the Blue Hen Institute, there's this idea of strife that's been introduced to us. Alexander kind of turns his doom eye onto you, or Bristow's literal evil eye person turns his doom eye onto you.
Yeah.
But and those are possible, and we know that almost explicitly that they're being done to at least some characters. But there's also this other thought that Matthew seemingly might have the same ability now that we know that now that we've kind of had more explicitly made clear to us, this doom is similar in the way that it can kind of impact a bad luck on you, a strife on you. Maybe Matthew also is responsible for this.
That's I don't buy it. It's a good tinfoil theory. Um, eh, yeah,
I
like
mean,
I
we
don't know.
still have this unexplained doom on the Kenneteers, right? I mean, we
Yeah,
kind of assumed it was Bristow.
yeah. I'm still sticking with that, and I'm assuming that will sort of be addressed in Arc 6.
Mm,
But yeah, I mean, he was the one who dropped them off, and there could have been a goodbye present from him. Like it's not impossible. I don't buy it, but like you could certainly make the case for it.
yeah, yeah. I also don't think it, but it's worth raising so that if it happens later, I can say
Yeah,
I knew it.
yeah, exactly. Stake your claim.
Hmm. Cool. So yeah, next we go with Alpian Marisica to visit the Candle Girl. We touched on this already.
Yep. Verona's angels
Yeah.
quickly forming up.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, it's a short scene. I mean, it's nice. It's good to be like, oh, there's going to be some nice others around that we 99.9% sure aren't involved in the Carmine Beast's death. Not 100%, but we're pretty sure, right?
Yeah, I hadn't
Um,
actually thought of that till I saw you'd written it there, and I was like, "Oh yeah, of course." I hadn't considered that our newcomers are essentially not suspects. Um,
Probably.
I'm going to assume they're not.
Yes,
Like,
I think I will too.
uh yeah, which will add like a fun dynamic to this whole thing, especially like again if we go to this idea of the Kenneteers coming back with all these new recruits, that's kind of shift. They just kind of got to a good place with the Kennet others, and then to
Mm,
have a whole bunch of new others who probably hate practitioners feels like it
mm,
could really sort of get sent backwards a bunch.
mm.
If there's a whole new dynamic.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, we'll have to see. Again, it's hard to know if there's going to be a stabilization of the status quo, or I don't know,
Yeah, well, I
or
mean,
not.
to that point, like something I wanted to bring up here because sort of this is our third segment and it defines this pattern of
Mm,
sort of like recruiting like or attempting to like we had the
mm,
goblins getting more goblins. We sort of had Matthew try to get three more like spirity vessely people. Um and like Marisica and Alpi are sort of our, like darkness girls and they're recruiting a
mm.
third like darkness girl. It's pretty explicitly called out the way the segment ends with like as the sun rose the three of them like stayed in the dark barn sort of thing.
Yeah,
um
maybe this is the expansion of factions within the town. People recruiting specifically to their little cliques. I don't know. That also doesn't seem to quite add up, does it?
Well, what jumped out to me is like, you know, I'm assuming Marissa and Alpi succeed because I desperately want this eye
It
girl
feels
to
like they've
join.
succeeded to me, and it'd be
Yeah.
weird for us to have Verona meet and form a bond with this character, then have them go and be recruited, but then that off-screen fail.
Yeah, and then we had the goblins succeed as well, but Matthew and Edith failed. And I'm thinking about if the town is growing in this way, we've had a lot of talk in the story about like balancing of scales and stuff. Like, if you think way back to the Awakening ritual, there was so much talk about like the Kenneteers keeping their stage balanced, so one of them didn't sort of take over.
Mm,
And if you look at Kennet through the same sort of lens, like if they were balancing all of the others that were in town, or if Miss
mm,
was balancing the others who were in town,
mm,
maybe we're getting like extra sort of people on the part of the stage that's goblins, on the part of the stage that's goth girls, and then the part of the stage that's Edith and Matthew, like spirits and vessels and stuff, is not getting any extra weight. Is that going to tip things
mm.
away from them? They're sort of
Interesting.
the de facto leaders at this point. Is that going to start to
Yeah,
change if they can't recruit more people for
I
their
like that.
segment?
I really like that thought that we explicitly see successes in the other places and well, not a failure, but not a recruitment for Matthew. Which maybe means that without the gardener, the garden is going to grow wildly in the wrong directions.
Yeah, because I do still remain convinced that Miss was very specifically building um a very intentional combination of others.
Mm,
And like that is sort of probably part of what's going to shit now that people who didn't understand that are sort of in charge and desperate. Um
mm,
and yeah, that might start to tip scales around and stuff in very interesting ways for us as readers.
mm. Yeah, we'll have to see. So then we go to our final perspective. And of course, this is somebody that we can't quite see, which confirms exactly who it is.
I love how this section unraveled for me at least. I'm kind of assuming here that other people had similar things where you're kind of reading through it and you're like, this feels like a path.
Mm,
Like this is very pathy. There's all this focus on the patterns of what things mean, and then oh, so does that mean this is some random finder? Is it a finder who's going to recruit Miss? It's just like no, it's just Miss herself. Um,
yes.
like the moment where you sort of figure that out, at least for me, it was like, oh fuck yes.
Yeah, yeah. Good times, right? And just the vibe of where Miss is so good as well. Like, Miss is in this insect corridor, kind of poking around, trying to figure out exactly how it works. It's great. It's just really fun to watch.
Yeah, she's such a great perspective to see something like this through because she's just got that knack for this stuff. And we've talked about this since even before she disappeared. She's got this real talent for spotting patterns and what things mean.
Mm,
And so being in her head as she sort of explores this house and
mm.
is like, "Oh, that means this and is connected to that," and vice versa, or like she knows what to be cautious about even if she doesn't understand it. Um, it's just the perfect perspective to see a path through.
Well, yes, and then of course it expands and becomes more significant, or the significance is revealed as we see that the way that Miss is thinking about this in terms of like labels and definitions is very, very important to her and her concept because she
Yeah,
has to fight against that, right? And so we get a moment early on where she's thinking about how like this place doesn't have any words, so things to do with words and word trickery are probably not relevant, and so the escape isn't to do with like saying the right code word. And it really starts to prime your thinking into this thought of like definitions, which obviously is very important to Miss.
yeah, because the paths more than anywhere else are sort of these distilled like little symbolic spaces where they pull on just a handful of maybe related symbols and build themselves out of the connective tissue they can draw between that.
Mm,
And yeah, like that. You could see like there's no chicken. It's a chicken and egg thing because it's like Miss is so good at doing all this stuff, but that's because she thinks about it. But that's because she's from the paths. Yeah, it's just so perfect. It's interesting as well because I think we used to talk a lot when she was around about like what label is she trying to get,
mm,
like what does she want to be defined as, because she seems so careful about avoiding certain kinds of roles and labels.
mm,
And now we've actually been in her head, and I'm starting to think like I got the impression that she doesn't want any labels. Like I think she's actually kind of
Well,
going out of her way to get none.
yes, and any labeling that she might be subject to seems to be exceedingly dangerous to her, right? Like we get a line later on where she thinks, and she kind of has a bit of reflection on the connections that she has to the places that she's been on the paths, and whether she can kind of leave at the moment. And the response is no. If I leave now, I'm not tangible enough to survive it.
Yeah, but like she's not. There's just so much, and even when she had that opportunity, like she presumably had opportunities to get the sorts of labels she might be interested in when she was in Kennet. So
Mm,
just sort of looking at the way she rejects any kind of labeling in this, like even to the point where she like won't shoot that guy because if she attacks him, that starts to become a label. I was just like, oh, I think maybe that was Mrs. whole point. Is she when you open these doors, other doors close, and she doesn't want that to happen. She just wants to be
yeah.
herself, and she shouldn't have to change that to fit some sort of specific role that the universe wants to put her in.
Yeah, I do quite like it when viewed through that lens. It feels kind of admirable and like
Yeah.
she's not backing down. She's not letting herself be defined by anything explicitly,
One what
which I
like
think is good.
and you could view this whole thing like the spirits putting people in roles and stuff. That's basically like society putting you in a box, and Miss
Mm,
as a creature of like the imagosphere that is the paths is sort of like, no, fuck you. I'm like, you can't put me in a box. I'm going to do whatever the fuck I want.
mm,
And you can't see me.
mm.
Uh,
Yeah.
and I mean that this is what really got me thinking about like what is Kennet like this has been sort of our big mystery for a while now. It's like what's this missing rule, or what garden was Miss tending to in
Mm,
Kennet? And I wonder
mm.
if that was the point. Maybe this sort of Hallow-esque thing that was being built with this perimeter, was she building somewhere where people are free from the societal expectations?
Well, we'll get to that in a moment, right? When she talks to the trio, I think.
Yeah. Okay.
Let's just quickly touch on the fact that she just performs a brutal takedown of this practitioner that she finds. The way that she does it is she gets in his face, and then seemingly he just kind of, I don't know, like gets sand in his eyes and has to like rub them to be able to see. And while he's kind of blinded, she just kind of pushes him into a trap, and then he gets crushed by a Dark Souls skeleton pinwheel, basically. I know that's not a reference that makes a lot of sense to you yet, Elliot, but stay tuned. It will.
I look forward to
Um,
it. Yeah, for me, what jumped out to me is how much Miss actually gives this guy a chance. Like, she was so anti-practitioner at the start of this story,
mm,
and maybe I'm being a bit unfair, or like I'm exaggerating the difference, but she really does try to play nice with this guy before like killing him for being a dick. Um,
mm,
but, like just like the way things ended with the Kenneteers and everything. I chose to read this as a bit of a like she's more willing to give people that chance, and like then when they let her down, she will send giant wheels at them. Um,
mm.
but she didn't want to kill this guy just for being a practitioner. And I don't know if the Miss we met in Arc 1 would have been quite as kind like that. She might have just seen he was a practitioner and immediately gone into damage control.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. True. Yeah, she gives him enough chances. He
Yeah,
really just doesn't
absolutely.
take them. It's his own fault.
She desperately tries to be like quite equal with him and be like, "Hey, we can trade information, we can help each
Yeah.
other." And he's like, "Or I could just bind you and you could help me." And it's like, "Okay, well, fuck you then." Um,
Yeah.
I think one last thing I want to bring up before Miss leaves this place is so she does go up to this broken window, and she actually
Mm,
lets it injure her twice. First when she's opening it, and then second when she stays in it too long.
mm,
I'm just bringing that up because she was so cautious the whole rest of this section. Like caution kind of defines the text as much as the pattern identification does. Um,
mm.
but it's like the second she gets to this window and sort of figures out it's going to let her see Kennet, she dives like way too deep in, and like especially when she gets her eyes or not eyes hurt.
Yes.
Um, it's very much because she just was sort of refusing to leave Kennet. It's a yeah, I think it's an interesting moment where she sort of is so attached to Kennet that she lets herself get damaged in order to keep some tabs on it.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. Which is good. Again, reassuring that Miss is not a villain. We haven't had her around, so that's kind of let conspiracy theories brew. But it's nice to see. No, she's pretty chill. I like her.
Yeah, and we've definitely had it set up at the end of this that there's the option she will join the story again. I can't wait for
Yay!
that.
Yeah. So Miss escapes from this trap house into Oak Avenue, falling past some old friends to some less old friends, as in they're only teenagers. It's great.
And she hasn't known them for as long.
Mhm.
Yeah, I
Two
mean,
levels to that
so Oak Avenue, it's the path Warbo wrote for the discussion
from
question
our
we read
discussion
ages ago.
question.
That
Yeah.
was it was awesome to sort of see it here. Um,
Yeah. What a
especially
great path as well. If you want more info on that, I guess what was that? It was way back. It was like our 2 discussion questions
it's
on
like
there.
stolen away like 3 or 4 or something.
Yeah.
I think people are linking it in the chapter threads on Reddit and stuff.
Yes, good.
So there are places to find it, but especially like having the context of having read that before, seeing that here, like so the ballerina obviously first shows up, and I quickly had reread like the Oak Avenue stuff as soon as Miss went there,
Mm.
and you see the ballerina. It was like, okay, the ballerina is either like helpful or the worst one. Which one's it going to
Yes.
be? You sort of I came in with this expectation that it was just like, no, it's Mrs. Old Chum. She's one of those people
Yeah.
who knows everyone, and I was like,
Yeah.
that's so good.
Well, yeah, she knows everyone whose whole shtick is not ever seeing their face.
Yeah. I just love this. Like, it just felt like such a like big dick moment where she just walks up and just like, "Hey, old friend," and like
Yeah.
I was like getting ready to
Help me
panic.
escape. Yeah. It's great. So yeah, of course, Miss takes this ballerina shortcut from one path to another, where the Kennetiers are. This beam of light bridge path looks very fun. Love it.
Yeah, it was one of the ones that was discussed as a way to get to Kennet, right?
Yes, yes. When they were
And
thinking of, but they ended up going with Jessica through the ruins.
yeah, which I mean, it seems like this was the better call, right?
Yeah, this
Uh,
would have been way more fun. The ruins were scary.
Yeah, well, aren't they having a blast? Like, it definitely seems like they're jumping around, like, whooping and stuff as they're going through
Yeah,
this path.
playing with gravity like it's a fucking game of Mario Galaxy.
Yeah,
That was my
exactly.
vibe from it.
Yeah, like, a little bit. Yeah, I mean, I guess since Avery is leading this, it didn't establish Verona and Lucy as finders. So there's
Mm,
talk about how they shouldn't do big paths like the Forest Ribbon Trail,
yes.
for that
Yeah.
reason. So, yeah, just
Yeah,
a
100%.
fun little jaunt through weird space.
Yeah. And so yeah, then obviously they call Miss. She shows up and they start chit chatting. And they talk about the seal and they talk about the mystery. Yeah, I guess what Miss is kind of conveying is that she feels that Kennet is potentially the next evolution, setting a precedent like the seal was. Um,
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean,
but she doesn't say that to
she
them.
doesn't
She kind
say
of
that.
sets up those thoughts and then thinks something similar to that later, but really doesn't. I mean, I guess she doesn't want to kind of structure it too much for them on the off chance that she doesn't. They kind of don't trust her enough to go down that path or something.
Or it would ascribe some sort of label to her to be the mentor. Like,
Yes,
she's actually trying to
yes,
avoid being the Guillerme.
yes,
Um,
exactly.
yeah. So like a lot of her focus here is on this idea that like others underestimated humanity back in the day. Like, and as humanity grew, they were able to sort of take old agreements and kind of bend them to suit them more. And obviously, we'll talk about the familiar bond a lot in
Mm,
a bit, but like that's sort of an example of where that sort of thing started off as something to try and put each other on equal footing or whatever, and it's now become like and master slave is almost the default
hmm
for most big practitioner families.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
but with the other detail that almost sneaks past is, and again, it almost sneaks past in the extra material at the end. The seal has two major parts, where it defines practitioners as those who are responsible for the affairs of others, but it
Mm,
does also define a small subset of powerful others that are responsible for practitioners as well.
yes.
And that jumped out to me because it kind of gets dropped quickly in both instances in this week's stuff where it comes up. But like, I don't see that,
Yeah,
right?
where have we seen that
I mean,
before?
the one example is our like Supreme Court of like the Carmine Beast, the Alabaster, and
Yes.
stuff.
But even that, they don't feel like they have like agency over practitioners, just some kind of arbitrations over karmic things specifically, right? Like we know Charles went to them about being forsworn, but for example, Alexander didn't go to them before deciding to set up the Blue Heron Institute, right?
No,
As far as we know.
one so the other type of other that is listed as being above practitioners is gods. And literally, we've only heard about one god really in this story, and that was the one
Mm.
that a bunch of the practitioners killed. So,
Hmm.
I think we even got told that things like the Carmine Beast and the Alabaster, they kind of exist in places where lords aren't ruling cities.
Mm.
So, like, if there's a practitioner who becomes like the lord of like I'm trying to think of a Canadian city, Toronto,
Hmm.
and then they're
Good hypothetical.
and then they're the Lord of Toronto. I got the
Yeah.
impression that like the Carmine Beast and the Alabaster and stuff wouldn't have jurisdiction there anymore.
Mm.
Especially since it's mostly a human place.
Yeah.
And it's like as humanity has expanded, they've said things like Carmine and Alabaster are being pushed to just those areas where humanity isn't massive. So places like Kent and the countryside.
Mm.
So it's sort of like humanity spreading, gods are seemingly being killed, so are Carmine beasts. It, it- I think the thing Miss is getting at here is that like the seal set up that one arm of the jurisdiction that was meant to be controlling the practitioners, and that side has
Yes.
just been slowly getting undermined and is getting whittled away.
Mm.
And that's probably why the Carmine Beast stuff is so important because depending on what happens with this situation, we might be establishing, yeah, as she says, a little bit of a precedent about where these supreme others sit in actuality.
Yeah, and it's also possible that, like, for example, a practitioner becomes the replacement for the Carmine Beast. Is that potentially where we're going? Is that how this is going to tie back together? As these checks and balances kind of things are failing more now, or yeah, there's a lot of things that could be the end point of where our political classes structure is going to head. But
Yeah,
yeah, we'll see.
I feel like at its core, though, the thing that's sort of happening is this group of others that's meant to sit at the top, which should sort of balance the scales a little bit between others and practitioners. Like,
Yes.
that is the part that's being eroded, and that's obviously just not good for others because that basically means that all of them are then starting to sit in that below animals part of the spectrum that has been defined, and we'll get to that because that's a whole thing. But yeah, and we'll end this now before I start linking all this seal stuff to the U.S. Constitution and
Yeah,
the
I mean,
current
I did
U.S.
just unironically say checks and balances without realizing that
Yeah,
if there's a clear parallel being drawn here.
yeah,
Um,
we've joked about the Carmine stuff being the Supreme Court, and this that feels
yeah.
let's just not go there. We'll leave that as an exercise to the listener to join those
Yeah.
dots.
Yeah, I mean, we got to write it out for a few more days. Um, so, yeah, there is conversation about suspects in the Carmine Beast's murder as well. And of course, Miss continues to refuse to give any concrete hints there. But it becomes clear that the Kennetiers have kind of solidly identified Matthew as the only real suspect that can tie into all the car stuff that's happened.
Yeah, like I'm in this weird position with this point because I can't refute their claim, but
Mm.
I just don't buy that it's Matthew. I don't know. No, I don't know.
No, I'm with you. If it is Matthew, as we said, there's more to the story, right?
Yeah, I feel weird because I feel like Walbo has just written us a whole thing saying, "Yeah, it's probably Matthew," and I'm sitting here going, "No, I don't like it. No,"
Mm.
but
Yeah.
I don't have any better ideas, but I reject this one.
Yeah. So yeah, and then finally, Miss leaves the Kennetiers, returns to the insect building, but this time it's broken technology instead. And so she continues her escape attempts.
Yeah, I mean, this was great because, uh, we've heard about how the paths are sort of unique to when each person goes into them, and it's such a cool way to see this, especially because the way Miss or Wildbow really walks us through the new things they're seeing, like little broken buttons and stuff, and like the prose mirrors the the prose from like before, you can instantly sort of think, oh, that's what the three flies are now, and oh, that like there's that arch again. It just, yeah, I was just really impressed with how this scene is now completely different, and I was still just able to follow what everything was from the earlier section. Like they're very well written.
Yeah, yeah, it's great stuff. I want to see more of Mrs. Journeys through the paths, but unfortunately, that's the end of that arc.
Yeah, so we get the Miss suggests that she'll likely be back before the end of the summer. So if we can stop the world ending before then, that will help. I assume. I don't know. Honestly, will she help? She doesn't seem particularly interested in actively doing so.
We shall see, I suppose. Yeah, I suspect when she comes back, everything will kind of be, coming to a head already.
Yeah, I could even see her being a perspective of an epilogue chapter. She makes it back and talks about where things ended up.
Yeah. Anyway, let's move on to our next arc, Arc 6, Cutting Class.
Snip, snip.
6.1, we're in Lucy's perspective. Yeah, the Kentiers are back at school. They are sitting in Mrs. Durocher's binding class, and Lucy is checking out Armine.
I mean, hell yeah! Like I was just immediately on board with this arc when it starts opening with a Durocher lesson. I think I've been pretty vocal about wanting to see more from her, so I was super excited for this. Kind of befuddled that these three legitimately thought they could do an actual class, but they seem to do fine, I suppose.
Yeah, it goes well. I mean, it's an interesting class.
Yeah, I was just thinking, wait, they need to go to bed.
They'll take a 20-minute nap before their next class.
There's no, just to jump ahead in a bit. There's no way they're making their afternoon classes. I'm willing to put money on that right now. That like they didn't even stay awake for their food to get delivered. They're not making it to afternoon classes.
Yeah. So actually, shall we touch on? There's this moment that I thought was kind of sad, where Lucy's checking out Armine and then ends this train of thought by thinking she was betting he'd say no anyway, which is just a sad kind of internalized vibe that Lucy is unattractive, which I find sad to think about.
Yeah, I suppose
I'm sure it's not true.
That might be the ghost of class ranker.
Of class ranker, exactly.
I'm just actually quickly Googling. Like, Amine's listed in the senior students as well. I think he might be 16 or older. That would be a factor.
Well, yeah, maybe he would say no then, based on that.
But that's probably not what Lucy's thinking.
Yeah, that's not how it felt to me.
I mean, there's the interesting point after this as well. Like after Lucy sort of goes through this thing about thinking about boys and having no self confidence about them, she then brings herself back to Earth by sort of saying, "Oh, my mind is wandering. I'm getting so distracted." And I was just kind of, I don't know. I think like
it's fine.
You're a 13-year-old girl. Like,
yeah, exactly. It's healthy.
Yeah, like thinking about that, like. It's not like you have anything better to do, like
Yeah, you're just waiting for class to start. What are you going to get tied up in an argument with the group sitting behind you? That sounds so much more fun.
Yeah, so I was a little like that. That was the other part that disappointed me, was to see her sort of thinking about that as just distractions. I don't know. Maybe I'm being unfair, but I was just like, I don't know. Seems normal, Lucy. Like,
yeah. So there's another moment where when they're talking about how they're hungry, Snowdrop sneezes, and I'm like, it just occurred to me, what does the sneeze mean? Is this because we know that Snowdrop, when she does like thumbs ups or whatever, it comes out as the opposite, and so I had kind of assumed the sneeze was just her way of saying like chiming in or agreeing with something. But it made me have the thought of, what is the opposite of a sneeze? Maybe she's trying to do something else. Like a nod? That was the best I could come up with.
I think it's just how Snowdrop sounds to other people when she's in opossum form. I think like I think we've had her sneeze a bunch of times, and it's always it's like her way of communicating when she's in opossum form. But like I do think, I swear I've seen a sneeze from Snowdrop mean yes and another one mean no. This one is not a yes or no response, so like it's almost like only Avery understands what they mean. Although some of the sneezes are in Avery chapters, so maybe it's like the robots in Star Wars, where like as readers we just get the beeps, but then all the characters respond like, yeah, that's right, R2D2.
Yeah, that's it. Maybe that's the equivalent. I thought for a second you meant the clone troopers saying Roger, Roger, and I was like, "Oh, is that what it is?"
No. Yeah, I meant like like R2D2, how he just does beeps, and then everyone's like, "Oh, good point, R2." Or the Wookiees too, right? Because they do that with Chewbacca as well, I think.
Yes. Yeah, so then as they're waiting for class, the Kentiers strike up a conversation with the group behind them, this other trio of girls.
The new friends.
Yes. Yeah. One of them is described as looking a bit Clockwork Orange, which is a great way to describe a new friend. Definitely not worrying at all.
I mean, that's a choice and a half for an aesthetic to go for, isn't it? Like,
I mean, but yeah, she wears a bowler hat and strong eye makeup. I mean, it's apt. I was definitely thinking it.
I haven't actually seen the movie, but yeah, you're right. Even from that
You can
description, I
picture
was like, yeah. Even from the description, I was like, yeah, okay, that sounds like that Clockwork Orange movie. And then the text was just like, it's Clockwork Orange.
Yeah.
Which yeah, like I don't know too much about it, but like in a world that's so loaded with meaning and stuff, I was just like, that's a weird aesthetic to go for. Like that's saying not good things about you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it's weird, isn't it? But so yeah, this conversation with the other trio almost immediately dissolves into hostility, and I was kind of like, we saw Miss last chapter and it reminded me, oh yeah, the three people that she picked are actually a pretty good choice if this is like the standard for what a teenage girl trio would often devolve into. Although having said that, there is a hint that it's just Strife fucking with them later.
Yeah, or not just Strife fucking with them. Like it's exaggerating what's there because like
Yes.
when they get into it, I mean it's sort of described as like, oh, they became unlikely friends, and like I mean that's fair because we get some of the history between their families, and it's like, as always, practitioners are sort of rushing to the bottom of the moral ladder, because it's like, oh, your grandpa was abusive, so we didn't want to marry him, and I was like, oh yeah, that's fair, and it's like, yeah, so just call off the marriage. Don't kill our family and like take all our stuff. And I was like, see, that's fair too.
That's a good point. Yeah. Both making good points.
um, so yeah, like it's sort of, it's there's that moment like the conversation sort of opens because one of the girls, I think it's Yadira, is like, wow, you three are like weirdly close for practitioners. And
Yeah, that's how the conversation starts. That's
yeah,
crazy. What a weird way to start a conversation with people you haven't met before.
but you see that here, like there is this Strife
Oh, yeah.
exaggerating it, but it's like that these
There's
three,
tension between any good practitioners.
these three are meant to sort of be friends, but like two of them are sort of like, unless it's some sort of Romeo and Juliet situation, it's kind of like you're friends with the person whose family like did a bunch of murdering and stealing from your family. Like that sort of friendship is only going to go so far when that person is still a proud member of their family, right? Like,
Yeah, it makes me think any group of practitioner friends that aren't from, that are from inside the system, unlike our Kenneteers, will have like beef,
yeah, there's just going to be this baggage, and you just can't. It's like when Zed was sort of like, when they were like, "Oh, who can we trust?" and Zed was just like quiet. Like I
Yeah.
think it was like at the start of Arc 4.
Yeah.
Yeah, like
I mean, the characters that our Kenneteers are closest to are like,
the other
Zed,
outsiders.
who attacked them at one point, or Nicolette, who attacked them at one point. Like, you can kind of just see that regardless, you're going to have some bad blood somewhere just because of how the practitioner system kind of works.
Yeah, exactly. And that Strife is just making it so that that's even harder than normal to get past.
Yeah. So, yeah, here's an interesting note. Yadira is an Arabic name that means suitable, worthy, beloved friend, which is nice, indicating good new
Confirmed.
ally. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I actually hope so. Like, these three seem not yet irredeemable. Like, something I sort of like, you see, like, the way Matthew and stuff like was praising the Kenneteers. I was just sort of like, we constantly see these three going around and making other people better. Like, they didn't beat the Aware Bristow sent at them. They got like Clem and Daniel to stop and be better. Nicolette and Zed, as you mentioned, are their friends now because they kind of convince them to be good people to them.
Yeah.
It took a bit with Nicolette, but Nicolette has been seemingly a great ally since they got here.
Yes.
They cut that deal with
Saved
Zed.
Snowdrop's life, probably.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like I just see the Kenneteers as these three girls running around making people better. Um,
Mm.
and like these three other girls seem like perfect candidates for that because they're from shithouse families, but they haven't yet grown into full shitheads, and maybe they're savable.
Mm. Yeah. Um, yeah, we'll see. I mean, they kind of write them off at the end, saying, "Oh no, they're Bristos. Let's steer clear." But we'll see.
Well, to be fair, Lucy's argument is let's just stay away from both sides. Like, let those two fuckwits
Yeah.
fight each
No.
other.
Yeah.
I don't care.
True. They can befriend them after this whole, power struggle has resolved itself.
Yeah, or
Um.
just they're friends with Nicolette or Zed, who are probably Team Alexander. So you got to balance the scales. Get some friends on
Yeah.
the other
True.
side.
Keep it balanced.
Yeah. So I just love that moment where Lucy was like, "Hey, what about just fuck both of them?" It's like, yes, finally somebody said it. Just let those two wear each other down. Like fuck them.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we should talk about the fact that Yadira is a fox girl as well, like Lucy. Because she sort of tries to chat to Lucy about that, and she, it's like, oh, why did you pick a fox? And Lucy's just sort of like, I like foxes, so I picked a
Yep.
fox. And it was funny because like the way Yadira sort of came at it, it took me back to some of the stuff that we started talking about in Arc 4. It's like practitioners from these big families are like shaping themselves to optimize the practice.
Mm.
Like I'm sure Yadira had some affinity for foxes, maybe, but like she wants to compare notes and stuff because she wants to like lean into fox imagery more, and it's like
Yep.
she's trying to shape herself to the stuff that already existed. Whereas like the Kenneteers and Miss has been helping them do this. They just like are true to themselves, and it's just
Yeah.
like they boost themselves, whereas other practitioners are like carving themselves and shaping themselves to fit something else. Find this like local maximum. The Kenneteers are just being encouraged to find ways to boost themselves.
Yeah. It's a good comparison. You're right. Lucy's choice is I want to do this for myself, whereas Yadira is kind of forming herself into something else. Mm.
Yeah, like honing herself rather than growing it, I suppose. And
Mm.
that's probably why Lucy was chosen here because that has sort of been explicit in Lucy's stuff. Like that's what Guillermet was helping her to do was grow herself so that she could make it tangible on battlefields and stuff.
Yeah. So yeah, Durashay begins her class, and we start out by talking about the seal as well as just the kind of concept of binding in general.
Yeah, it's interesting how this all fits into the stuff Miss was talking about. I think Miss was the one who made the comment about how like language evolves. So the deals made hundreds of years ago don't necessarily apply to the modern world. Again, I'm not bringing up the U.S. Constitution, and like that's sort of what's going on here with the term binding. Like
Mm.
Durashay sort of bring up like everything is binding, any sort of control. And it's just like, okay, so
Mm.
if we're using like binding as this way to talk about how you interact with others, like it's just such a toxic way to think about every
Yes.
interaction. Like Durashay has
It's
let this,
everything's boiled down to a power struggle, right?
yeah, like she's let this concept of binding infect her mind on like viewing every interaction as some sort of like vying for control and trying to conquer the other person.
Mm.
Like her example of, oh well, what if I like trick you into staying into my office? And I was like, well,
Mm.
why are you doing that? It's such a stupid ass thing to do. I know it's just an example, but
Yeah.
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 Um. a-
Um.
so the other thing I just wanted to interject here is Durashay also talks about like the seal and how it affects others, and it's so interesting because she comes at it from such a different place to Miss. Obviously, like, and I don't think it's a mistake that we're seeing these side by side.
Mm.
But what Durashay sort of focuses on here is there's this sense that the seal just lets others be around humans. Like she sort of says, others that
Mm.
aren't in the seal, they don't get near humanity without incurring a cost. Whereas, like, if you're on the
Yes.
seal, it's sort of like, you still shouldn't do things like attack innocents or whatever outside your rules, but you can at least be near them. And as long as you don't get seen, it's fine.
Yeah.
So it's just like it's turned into just attacks to be near humanity.
Mm. Or to
Um,
be able to kind of to not have to avoid the trappings of humanity, I guess.
yeah, but you can see how the seal would have grown in that way because as humans have spread across the globe and taken over more space, it makes the seal something that's harder to avoid. And that's sort of
Mm.
what Durachet says, but not from the perspective of thinking that that's a bad
Of an
thing.
other, yeah.
Yeah, whereas like from the others, you can actually sort of see this. And I think Marisica talked about it in Arc 2, actually. I've been reading Jay's live reads, and they just got to this part where Marisica
Mm.
sort of mentioned that, like, yeah, that was sort of the trap that got laid out is when the Seal Solomon was made. This idea that, like, if you weren't on the seal, you couldn't go near humans was probably less of a problem. And
Mm.
then now that there's 7 billion or whatever of us, that's actually like you can't not sign up.
Yeah, there's less and less space available to you now. Actually, I guess Canada is. I mean, these stories take place in Canada. I saw an image today to do with population densities of different countries, and us in Australia and up in Canada are two of the best places in the world that are untouched by humanity that aren't like Antarctica. So it's probably a good place for this story to take place because there's just too many humans everywhere else.
Yeah, I could see that. I mean, it's interesting because somewhat in Canada as well, but also in Australia. I feel like a big part of that is just because so much of the land is useless
Well,
to
I mean,
humans.
and that's all that would be left to others is the
Yeah.
terrible, uninhabitable to humans land.
But like, if most others are of humanity to some degree, like a lot of their sustenance seems to rely on humans and that
Yeah,
sort of thing.
yeah,
Those places are presumably just as shitty for others.
yeah,
Like
yeah,
to stick with the Australian example, how many like desert others do you think there are? Like, I
yeah,
imagine it's actually not many.
yeah. No, I would imagine that too. I mean, yeah, I guess that doesn't track because they would need some kind of sustenance and they need some kind of like ideas to build them up and stuff like that.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Something else worth touching on is uh, the fact that Lucy is so easily able to like see the tension in this room. She kind of tunes into the way that into Durachet's vibe as this unrestrained restlessness is where she kind of lands on it. But I would probably call it excitement. I get the vibe Durachet is excited for how this lesson's going to go.
I mean, yeah, it's pointed out every time Durachet actually smiles, and there's only two of them. The first time is when she tells them she's going to unleash a monster, and the second time
Mm,
is when she gets to unleash the monster.
yes.
It's like,
Yeah.
which I think is saying a lot about her character. You're right. Avery also contributes to this. I think Avery's the one who points out. Did you pronounce it Amine or
Amine? Yeah, I don't know.
I was
I
calling
just took
him
a guess.
I was calling him amine, but I think that's just like amino acid, but
Like
without the
the
O.
Armine Beast, we call him.
Regardless of how you say his name, like Avery's sort of the one who's like, "Hey, that guy's really tense." Um,
Mm,
which I guess Lucy was, she should have been checking him out. She should have noticed he was tense.
mm,
But yeah, you're right. Like Lucy was just. I'll talk on this a bit later, but Lucy was just the perfect choice to have our perspective for the Durachet class. I think.
mm. Yeah, yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's just fun stuff, right? And then Durachet reveals uh, why she's excited, which is she wants to teach you the suitable amount of fear that you should face when you're up against an other, and how it feels to be up against an other when they are unrestrained and here to kill you. And of course, the only way to teach that is to release an other to attack the class, which she's going to do at the end of the lesson.
I love how
Good
she compares
stuff.
this to that thing of like as a kid, like learning about hot stoves. Because I mean, I'm
Mm-hmm.
pretty sure that is actually a universal experience. It's definitely one
Yeah,
I went through where it's like, don't touch the stove, it's hot. Don't touch the stove, it's hot. I touched the stove and it was hot.
and it was
Um,
hot. Yeah.
and she's sort of like, yeah, that is usually the case with people, and I need to find a way to make it so that you don't have to go through that because in this situation, it's not a touch you'll survive.
Mm,
And so she pulls out three others to sort of use as her examples for this lesson.
mm,
And I wanted to just talk about those because I couldn't help but notice that like we've got the genre, which is like this big force of nature. The compiler error, which is this like modern technological monster, and then Mr. Rudbeck, who
mm,
is just the snake that will possess yourself. So we've kind of got like Duche's showing off, like, oh, I've put so many things under the seal and I've conquered them. And she pulls out like
mm,
a giant force of nature, modern technology and like this thing that is associated with like humanity's self. So like I couldn't help but read into that as this like loaded symbolism of her sort of saying, look, I can
Yeah.
conquer things that conquer people, I can conquer nature, I can conquer
Mm.
technology, like look how hot shit I am.
The more charitable read maybe is that she wanted a variety of different types of others so that there wasn't one simple answer to whatever she unleashed. But I think you're right that it's a bit of both at the very least.
I was just getting ready to jump in with
Ah, nice. Yeah, classic. Good stuff. Classic reference. Now the trumpet in the background, etc. So I love this part where Verona says, "I bet she pulls a fast one on us." And one of the others on the stage is like, "That book growing legs and walking at us." Verona whispered, which is just such a trope-aware response. I loved it.
Especially because I had the same thought, and then it's like as soon as you read that, I was like, okay, well, Verona's going to be wrong. Like it's like the double trope awareness where when you see the trope aware protagonist, I'm like, well, okay, it's not going to be that then. Suddenly I'm on
Mm.
Team Lucy where shit's getting real.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, especially because Lucy kind of vibes out based on the reason Lucy thinks that's not right is based on Durachet's reactions and the fact that Durachet seems to be taking too much glee in this to let them off
Yeah,
easily.
and she
Um,
doesn't strike me or presumably Lucy as the type to get that smug glee out of like a little trick.
out of a little wordplay, yeah,
If she
exactly.
was a fairy associated practitioner, I'd believe
Yes,
it.
maybe.
But
Yes.
yeah,
And Lucy almost stumbles on the correct answer. She thinks to herself, I'm questioning why I'm taking this class, which is almost correct based on the correct answer that Durachet reveals later, which is bail.
yeah. Although again, I think Lucy and Durachet are such a great fit. I'm very confident Lucy will be back in Durachet's classroom.
Yes, I think so too. So yeah, with this sword of Damocles dangling over their heads, I suppose the students have to start paying attention to Durachet's class, continuing on positive and negative, and hallowed bindings.
Yeah. Uh, I mean, all these binding ideas are really cool. I think we sort of touched on some of this stuff already, like just with like
Yes,
Hallows. Like the Hallows jumped out to me because that obviously sort of relates to the whole Kennet thing. Like these are just all
yes,
these clues where on a reread, I'm going to be like, it was right there. But
yeah.
yeah, fun lesson. I got a lot out of it.
um, yeah, I got some. I mean, yeah, it's fun, and this kind of happened with the bonus material too. A fair amount of it is just like, man, this is good shit, but there's not much to say about it. It's just kind of go read it. It's good. In fairness to Durachet, I think this is the highest class engagement I've ever seen. If you're going to release a monster at the end of a class, they're going to start paying attention.
Yeah, like teachers take note. This is you got to add
Yeah,
stakes to
this
your
is how you do
class.
it. Yeah, give a little spice. You know.
Yeah, it's classrooms that it's too safe. The kids, their lives aren't on the line when they're doing math, and that's the problem.
Mm, yeah. So you need to unleash some kind of problem, life-threatening problem that only math can solve. Oh, there's two trains speeding towards us. Which one's going to hit us first? Or I
Yeah,
don't know,
I'm
maybe
I'm
something like that.
imagining like some sort of saw situation where you need to calculate the trajectory or some shit. Like I don't know.
Oh yeah, 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 yeah.
That's what saw.
Calculate the yeah.
Yeah,
I
that's
like
what
that.
saw needed. Is it should have actually been math problem.
Yeah, more math.
That's
I
why
would
the
watch more of
franchise
those
died.
movies. Yeah. What's Saw 2 plus Saw 7? That's what you need. Anyway, so Lucy thinks of a creative answer to this problem, threatening Durachet, which this is a great, like, I really loved this response. Like, it's such a perfect Lucy response, and it ties so well back to what Durachet said at the start that for a moment I was like, damn, Lucy, is this the correct answer? It's awesome. It's baller. I'm sad it's not correct.
Yeah, I hadn't
I mean, it's
even.
correct in some ways. It's incorrect in the way that I think Durachet didn't expect Lucy to actually shoot her, which maybe if she had, it would have worked.
I definitely got the impression Lucy got a lot of points with Durachet though for thinking of
Yeah.
this and like threatening to do it.
Mm.
Because yeah, as you said, I hadn't made that connection, but it's so perfect that like Lucy did not give in to the social pressure of not shooting your teacher in the face.
Yeah. Um, And I think Durashay obviously liked this answer. I think Durashay is
Yeah.
having a lot of fun here, right? Like she lets out this little pixie as just a kind of like, hey,
Well,
maybe it was just a trick.
to psych
Let
out
your guard
Verona.
down. Yeah. And then lets out the fridge beast to really hit you with the panic.
Yeah. And so this is sort of where I wanted to talk about why, like, when I saw we were in the Durashay class and we were in the
Mm.
Lucy chapter, it was like one of those moments, and I've had this in all the other Wildbow stories as well, where like he puts two characters in a room together, and I'm sort of like, oh, of course. Like, why didn't I think of this? Like, when I saw we were doing Durashay class with Lucy, I was like, of course these two are going to get on. Like, they're similar in that way that they don't placate who they are to other people. Like
Mm.
they're both just going to
Mm.
wear who they are on their sleeves, and people describe them as intense or whatever, but like they just sort of wear that, and they're like, well, the people who matter will rise up to the challenge. It's so like, of course, there's going to be a bit of an affinity between these two because they're just both
Yeah,
so no
interesting.
nonsense.
Yeah, and they define, like they don't change themselves to fit the world around them. They trust that they are who they are, and the world around them will, when it's important, the people who are important will kind of adjust.
Exactly. And you sort of see that with like how Durashay gets her apprentices. Like it's the people who
Mm.
can stand to follow her who become her apprentices. It's not
Mm.
like whereas Alexander's fucking going out and recruiting assholes. And Ray, I don't mean, I don't know what Ray's tactic is. I don't know how that works. Um,
Mm.
but like that sort of link between Lucy and Durashay, I think finally I had some like other things click into place as well, because I think I talked ages ago about wanting to try and link the Blue Heron Institute like teacher trio a bit to the Kenneteers.
Mm.
And, and like obviously this isn't the whole thing. Like I'm not saying the Blue Heron Institute trio exists only for this connection. There's more to them than that. But
Mm.
if we sort of look at Durashay as a bit of a dark reflection of Lucy, in that there's these similarities in how they're no nonsense and want the world to step up to them. But
Mm.
Durashay has kind of turned that energy towards conquering and enslaving others, whereas Lucy's using it to make people be better.
Mm.
And similarly, like Rad Ray Sunshine was this person who was bright and happy, but he suffered this hurt. He lost someone close to him, and he's kind of closed himself off. And like unlike Avery, he hasn't seemed to fully reopen that wound.
Mm.
Like he's stayed isolated from a lot of people. And then potentially the controversial one is like Alex and Verona.
Yeah,
They're both not sort of classically powerful, but they're smart cookies, and they tend to naturally do
they're
well
naturally
in this
yeah,
world.
natural practitioners for sure.
But again, like Alex has turned that into being a controlling dick stain, and Verona has
Mm.
not.
Mm.
So yeah, it's like the separation between these two groups of three is that the Kenneteers are using these aspects of themselves to connect with each other and lift each other up, whereas the Blue Heron teachers, while they are friends, it's that like practitioner type of friend we were talking about earlier in the chapter, where it's like you
Yeah.
can't ever quite trust each other, and you bring each other down a little bit as well as hold each other up.
Mm. Yeah, it's interesting just the sheer number of trios that we are getting set up for us in this story, huh? We see a lot of trios to compare our Kenneteers to, I guess. I like the comparison between the teachers and the Kenneteers because it's like the clear bond that the Kenneteers have is in such contrast to how the teachers seem to have absolutely no care for each other at all, right?
Yeah. It's interesting. I do get the impression from the way they talk about their past that there is some sentimentality there,
Mm,
but also like cold logic in the moment would totally override that sentimentality.
yeah.
Whereas, like I don't, unless things go terribly wrong, I don't picture Lucy in 10 years letting something overpower her sentimentality and love towards Verona and Avery.
Yeah.
Whereas I could see Durashay turning her back on Ray and Alexander if something came up.
Mm, mm, yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think there's no way that they will. I mean, they've made vows to literally not abandon each other, right?
Yeah, shit would have to go so fucking wrong for the Kenneteers to to go sideways, and I don't want to see that happen.
Yes. Durachet reveals what the correct answer to this puzzle was: to leave the class. And Lucy kind of reflects on, hey, maybe you're just meant to leave in some situations as they head to their next classes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, they do head off to their next classes in theory, but they're taking a nap, and as I said earlier, they're not going to wake up. I don't think.
Yeah.
They're so tired. Lucy didn't even use the thing. We didn't really call that out, but she made a gun, like, you know, out of a soda can. That used to like wipe her the fuck out, didn't it? Whereas like now she does it after an all-nighter.
Yeah.
It's impressive.
I mean, I guess they're getting more powerful.
Yeah, seemingly.
So yeah, it's an interesting note that this chapter ends on. Lucy reflecting on the idea that something that we've kind of touched on before, maybe they're not equipped to deal with this Carmine Beast situation. Yes, they swore that they had to investigate, but they've probably fulfilled that obligation now. They really don't necessarily have any further obligation to get involved in this situation beyond their general attachment to Kenneth, right?
Yeah, I think if clues come up, there might be some like token amount of investigation they need to do. But yeah, like theoretically, there's no need for them to go above and beyond to continue chasing down the suspects. And yeah, it is interesting because this Carmine Beast stuff, like there was a lot of thought put into, like scattered amongst learning about the bindings. There was all this stuff like, oh, how might this apply to the goblins, to the fairies, to John? Like, what do we need to research so we can apply what Durachet just taught us to the Kennet others? I don't think applying it to the power of the Carmine Beast came up, and like that would be the concern that Lucy's point brings up here is like, say it's Edith, and you're all prepared to bind Edith as a girl by candlelight, like a fire related spirit, but then she pulls out like Carmine Beast powers and shit. Like, you know, that could totally fuck up stuff that's targeting her as a girl by candlelight. And then and so like as you said, the other side of that is, are these three even able to prepare to fight something like the Carmine Beast? I don't know.
Yeah, good question. I also don't know. I don't even know what that means. Yeah.
I did see as well, like lots of people having conversations just as we start to sort of round out this chapter, like theorizing ways to bind others and what would work and stuff. It just made me realize how much of a good game just like bind that other would be.
Yeah.
Almost.
Trying
I
to
don't think
figure
we're
out how
doing
you have to bind this thing.
Yeah, like I don't think we're doing a discussion question this week, but like go like, how would you bind the Carmine Beast's energy? Would be like, like, you know, we're not doing an official one, but if you want to talk about that, chuck it in the discussion thread.
Yeah, put it in the yeah, definitely. Yeah, and that's the end of 6.1. And now we dive fully just into a textbook, which is the Famulus text. We read from the Famulus book, Learning About Familiars. What a good textbook it is.
I mean, just to start off, the cover that Walbo's chucked in here as well is beautiful. The leather, the goldness of the logo, it just really emanates like, I don't know what the word I wanted, like that it's an expensive and valuable text. Like, you know, you sort of take one look at this cover and you're like, that's a fancy ass book.
Yeah. Man, it's beautiful. And like, man, Walpo is getting so good at art. God, it's great.
There's like another picture halfway down that is sort of barely in context, but was just sort of like just a beautiful picture.
Yeah, so good.
Yeah, Walbo can do the outsides of books as well as he can do the inside almost.
Yeah.
This was another. Oh, sorry, I was just gonna say this is another one of those extra material parts that just gets me really excited for what packed dice is going to look like after Pale. Like this is the sort of stuff. Like for those who haven't really looked into packed dice, and I haven't looked into it too much myself. I haven't done like a thorough read, but that is in part because it's very much a sort of work in progress. And you can sort of see like the document outlining how familiars work in something like packed dice now just has so much more to build off of. This is such a great world for tabletop role-playing games, and these extra materials are going to be such assets for building out that game.
Yeah, for sure. So I guess I want to touch on just like, I mean, this is a textbook. Go read it. There's a lot of interesting things that we'll talk about, but I really just liked the etymology of the word familiar and how well that fits for the idea of being both a member of your family but also having an implied servitude. That's just such a such a cool word. I love it.
Not only is this a great, or yeah, just like it's like one of the first paragraphs that goes through this etymology. It's such a testament to how fantastic Warbo is at taking like these existing concepts. Like the idea of a witch's familiar exists in so much other stuff. Like, you know, it's an
Mm,
old mythology as well as being in other works.
mm,
And Warbo just has this knack in the other verse of taking this, distilling it in a really cool way and integrating it into this universe. Like here, like I don't know how many other things I've read or seen that have familiars would have thought about it to this extent. Like this is just
mm,
so cool, and it just adds up with what we've seen in the story. He's put more
mm.
thought into what the word familiar means than I would imagine even the people who originally came up with it did.
Yeah, it's great. It is very good. Oh, here's something I want to discuss. They talk about the hierarchy between creatures, and they have the old hierarchy that used to that was kind of accepted, but definitely it has vibes of this is what they thought before, but we haven't really updated it too much. Where it's man over animal over other, which we hinted at before. It just makes no sense. Like others clearly aren't like they come from people. Like Matthew is an other that explicitly was a human. It doesn't make sense.
Yeah, but Ruben, they've said that it's the case in the
Oh,
scientific
sorry. Yes,
textbook.
of course. Yeah.
Um,
Therefore,
I mean,
yeah.
look, we're gonna call out the bias of this fucking text a bunch in this episode, but yeah, you're right. This is such a ridiculous case of like, you know, everyone's saying that that's how others are, and then it's sort of becoming true in that sense that just because everyone thinks of it, like, oh,
Mm,
everyone thinks that way, so it it becomes true in action, not in essence,
mm,
if that makes sense. Um,
yeah.
because yeah, and something we recently called out. So there is that little bit where it's sort of like, oh, you know, gods are above man. And what's funny is again that gets mentioned and then just sort of immediately disregarded by the authors.
Mm-hmm.
And as you
Mm,
say, they refer to this as the ancient hierarchy, and I feel like there is an implication there that we're sort of getting rid of that one part where the others are a bit on top of us because it sucks. Um,
mm,
from the practitioner perspective, like
yeah.
that that
Yeah.
part of the hierarchy is just gets no attention throughout this.
Yeah, for sure. Oh, yeah, yeah. And it like it's such interesting framing because we frame practitioners and familiars as practitioners the master, familiar the children, whatever, the servants. But then we also have gods as these huge beings. And then we also have practitioners who are kind of in essence the familiars to these gods, right? Like a practitioner who's like a I don't know the word for it, like a paladin type, you know, a priest, a servant of a god, gets access to their power in exchange for servitude, which is more or less, I mean, it's slightly tweaked, but it's kind of similar to the practitioner familiar relationship, right? Like, but it's just not, it's a very human centric worldview, I guess, that humans are looking through.
Yeah. Well, I think that's why I'm kind of assuming the reason we got this now is because we're going to be doing more Durocher stuff soon. And
Yeah.
she obviously has her familiar was like some big primeval or something, wasn't it? That was like
Yes.
discussed. It is
Which is
one of these.
mentioned as one of the, yeah, big
Yeah.
things.
So it is this big, very powerful being, and I feel like that's why we might be talking about this now because is that what we're going to start to explore? Like Durashay is someone who is tied into one of these very, very powerful beasts, but she's so oriented around conquering others, and I would believe that she shares the view of this textbook.
Mm,
So how does she reconcile that? You know,
mm,
how are we going to have that angle of, oh yeah, she is tied to a powerful other, but she views it in this way that is still like humans are on top or whatever.
mm, yeah. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, if that's where we're going to explore Durashay's relationship with her familiar a bit more potentially, which I agree could be quite likely. It's interesting to see how she feels about this, and
Yeah,
how much she's in control of that relationship. I guess we don't really know, but
yeah,
maybe we'll find out.
and because the other people associated with her are like Ulysses and Amine or whatever, and they're like the people who are the patrons to these gods. So how do we reconcile those explicit cases where there are the gods above the practitioners?
Yeah.
How do they see
Um,
themselves fitting into it?
yeah. Interesting. We'll see, maybe. We also get case studies to define some of these relationships. We get Calhoun Mott and Terence Hay.
I mean,
Great, good stuff.
these stories are so blatantly like chosen to be like human other cooperation. It's bad. It's very dangerous. Like,
Mm,
you know, deal with
mm.
caution.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, God, aren't these stories great though? They're just so fun. They like the Calhoun Mott story is set up as like being an extension of what is more or less a historical fairy tale. To the extent that I actually thought for a moment Calhoun Mott was a real. It talks about, oh, this is the version of the story you might have heard. I was like, oh, is this a real thing? I looked it up. I couldn't find anything. But yeah, man, it's cool, isn't it?
Yeah, it's just one of those things that makes this world feel so fleshed out that you have a textbook that has like historical basis in world.
Yes,
Like it's not
yes,
just listing out rules and stats. It's
yeah.
drawing from a fictional history. Like that just adds so much richness to the book and the world.
Mm, yeah, definitely. They're great. The Terence Hay story is interesting as well, which is kind of, I mean, it's basically the point of that story is warning against trying to do things that aren't traditional, familiar, like rituals and relationships, right?
Yeah,
Um,
it absolutely is. It's like I think the first one, the Calhoun Mott, is like this blatant propaganda story of don't trust others, they'll stab you in the back. And
yeah,
then this one is kind of like, or if you do manage to get a good deal with one, but it's not the tried and true method, it'll still hurt you anyway.
yeah. Yeah, exactly. It's a no-win situation.
Well, that's what it's presented as
Yeah.
with these two cherry picked examples.
But as we'll see later, there are better ways. Later on in the book, we also get examples of the different types of relationships that there can be between practitioner and familiar, which are kind of labeled and categorized for us.
Yeah, and I think what's funny is it sort of goes. It starts with the tyranny type, which is just like,
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
Great.
how can you? Yeah, because so it's the one where it's like the practitioner is completely on top of the familiar, and then it sort of
Mm-hmm.
scales right down to the last one is the collapsed or failed, which is where the other kind of owns the practitioner.
Which is the same but inversed, right? I
Exactly.
mean,
Like,
it's exactly right.
yeah, we go through this scale, and so there's like elevation, which is just where the other is lifted a bit by the practitioner, and then there's like subverted, which is just like these names just tell you what you're meant to think of them. That subverted and
Yeah.
elevation are just kind of the same, but the other way around, and it's like, oh no, but one of these is bad.
One of these is normal and right and pure and good, and one of them's bad and
Yeah.
evil. Yeah.
Like, yeah, the bias of just presenting these inverses and saying one is good and one is bad through the way they're framed, it's just so blatant.
Yeah. Um, there's this quote that comes in later in the chapter talking about others as well, where it says, they lack the ability to run their own lives and are therefore better off and happier in a system where their lives are run by others. Which I just thought was, oh no, sorry, I've read out the wrong quote there, Elliot, actually. That's just from a BBC page about how people used to justify slavery. Sorry, I must have mixed up these quotes.
Oh, that's so weird.
How did that get in there? I don't know. But no, I mean, there's quotes like
Yeah.
it's rough, right? Like that was the thing that I thought for a moment we could play a game of guess whether this is a quote from a practitioner or from a white plantation owner. It's pretty, yeah, not
Yeah.
great.
No, there were so many points in my live read where I was basically just like pulling out a paragraph and my comment was just yikes. Like,
Yeah. Yeah, capital Y yike. In fact, I pulled out a quote. People can't see this, but in my notes, I've pulled out a quote that says, others are often simpler existences. And my comment on it is just yikes.
Yep. And I think because that line even
Yikes.
comes from a bit where it's like, this may not sound egalitarian, but like, blah,
Yeah.
blah.
Oh my God.
It's like there was another moment like this in 6.1 where I think when we got introduced to the new friends trio of the girls, and one of them introduces the trio, and then the other one's like, "Oh, you didn't mention my surname, like you classist." And she's like,
Mm-hmm.
"Oh, is it classist if I just didn't do it because your family doesn't matter?" And I was like,
Mhm.
yeah, no,
Yes, it
that's
is.
by pretty much the definition, textbook example.
Yeah,
Yeah, like that. There's so many moments like that in this book where it's just like you're just reading it and you're like, oh, come on, you can't be serious.
yeah. Yeah. It's so it's like you feel a bit crazy that the practitioners in universe don't see it.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. But to focus on the other aspect for a second, because the other comparison that gets made a lot here is this comparison to marriages, because obviously, like in real life, marriage is a very intimate and formal connection that you make with another person, and
Mm,
in this story, like getting a familiar is similarly a very intimate, important, and formal, presumably, like agreement that you make with an other. And what I wanted to bring up is it's mentioned that there's an upcoming rise in casual familiar relationships, which is the term that's describing when someone is crazy enough to pick an other that they get along with rather than something that will be optimally controllable.
mm.
And like that's how far behind this bullshit is that it's only just now reaching the practitioner world in 2018. That like it might be common for somebody to like partner for life with someone who they actually get on with rather than doing
Yeah.
like arranged or political marriages.
Yeah, the marriage analogy is such a great one because it shows the concept of marriage, like whatever 40 years ago, is where the concept of taking a familiar is kind of stuck at. It's this like, or not even 40, it's the fucking 20s like vibe, right? Of like, um, oh, this is your wife is your domestic goddess, and a marriage is explicitly between a working man and a housewife, and that's it. And like that's what this is, right? Like
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
what the familiar relationship is, and it's yeah, I don't know. Jump
Because it
ahead
kind of
90 years, and we'll get there.
Yeah, because it kind of even goes further. Like they constantly establish, oh, this is like a Western tradition, and if you compare it to Western marriage, the sort of mostly political or power based marriage thing just hasn't been a thing outside of very high
Yeah,
classes for a long time.
yeah, for
Um,
sure.
yeah, I mean, this book, even when it's describing casual, familiar relationships, it's clearly there's clearly the author has a bit of distaste for this new
Yes.
trend that millennial practitioners are doing.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
and whether it's sort of like, oh, you need to be careful with casual, familiar relationships because they can turn sour. Like this bullshit of like love doesn't last forever, so you really should be marrying for power or like economics, not for love.
Yeah, yeah, yikes. Yeah. Yeah. So the next section of the book is learning about the bind between practitioner and familiar, which it's interesting. Like, I mean, it all kind of makes so much sense when you read it. But yeah, we hadn't really realized to the extent the actual bind between practitioner and familiar, and the type of practitioner and the type of other that is the familiar, has so many implications in the like exchange of power that I thought was so interesting to read about.
Yeah, well, I mean, it does. It does really sort of bring up like how much you need to put a lot of thought into this. Um,
Mm,
like there's this idea of do you pick a familiar that accentuates your current traits, or do you pick one that complements you and will show up your weak spots? And I mean, you can ask the same question about finding a partner in real life. Like, do you find someone who's very similar to you, or do you opposites
mm,
attract?
mm,
Yeah, like this chapter to me basically just establishes like every relationship will be unique and you need to figure out your boundaries with your partner basically.
mm. Yeah, yeah. Um, so yeah, next we learn about the different kinds of relationships that might exist outside of the ones that we learned about before. I guess they weren't worthy of being included in the main section.
Well, this is more of a focus on like the common archetypes, I suppose, or like yeah, it's not like these categories to me sat alongside like tyranny and all that. Like some of these are tyrannical, some of them are not. Like it's
Mm,
almost just like some common tropes of these relationships. I felt like the focus in this section was how society or the spirits, it's the same thing, view you based on your choice of partner. Like,
Mm,
this section to me was sort of saying, here is, if you choose this sort of partner, this is what that says about you, and this is what everyone's going to think about you and your partner, like based on your familiar bond.
mm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, interesting. You're right. The main thing I got out of this section was just kind of the depths of the different kinds of relationships, and the fact that it could be much worse than we see in the, in air quotes, Western world, but also it clearly can be better. So we saw Russia as an example of like others that are much more subservient and bound. Uh, and then we also saw Namibia as this like progressive ideal of human other relationships being positive and like modernized, I guess, which was great. I loved it. It's aspirational, the Namibian section, right?
Yeah, like, and it reminded me of the Kenneteers, in the sense that, like, Nadiesta,
Mm,
hopefully that's how that's pronounced, from Namibia, like, they talk about how, she grew up in this village where the others sort of live alongside humans, and she established this pattern of, like, just being able to work with others on an equal footing, which is just seemingly bizarre to this author. And they're like, yeah, so she's established this weird pattern of being able to work with others, and she carries that into like the Western world. And like, yeah, like I kind of see the Kenneteers doing that. I've already talked today about like how I think they keep going around and making people better, and that's sort of this pattern they're establishing. Like they can meet up with anyone, even people who think they're their enemies, and the Kenneteers just turn them around and make them better. Maybe they won't
mm.
defeat Bristol and Alex. Mate, I don't know. Those two seem kind of irredeemable, but maybe they will slow them down a little bit. I don't know.
Yeah, yeah, I guess. Yeah, we'll see. Uh, yeah, man, I loved seeing. I mean, we've talked about this whole story about how it could be, how the Kennet could be a bastion or a parable of a change to the standard Western dynamics between practitioner and other. And I just love seeing like there's evidence that could prove that it could be done.
Yeah,
I
there
love
are
that.
places in the world where this is possible.
Mm,
Although the text went to great efforts to make sure it was clear that this is like very rural
yes.
Namibia. Like,
Yeah.
you have to be far away from civilization to mingle with others. There was the really interesting story about the guy and his familiar, and they went traveling, and I think it was like somewhere in Norway. They got caught up in this undercity, and it went really bad.
Yes.
And this just started to bring up, wasn't really related to familiarism in my head so much, but like something we've seen with, I think it was the Musas or the Muslas,
Mm.
Raquel from last chapter was one of them. Like they've traveled the world or whatever and come back, and some of them have multiple implements and multiple familiars and stuff.
Yes.
And and this traveling story kind of brings up the same thing. Whereas like when you go traveling, you pick up little bits of spirits from where you've traveled, and you can bring little bits of those conventions back with you.
Yes. How
Um,
cool is that? I love that
yeah,
idea.
it's so perfect because like that's kind of what a lot of people view travel as, right? Like it's meant to be, traveling is internationally sort of meant to be a culturally enriching experience. You're meant to go and
Yeah.
see how other people live and try and learn from them, and that's that is sort of the being captured here in spiritual form. In fact, like it's like the, again, taking something that is a perception in the real world and making it tangible in the other verse.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. Definitely. It's what this story's all about.
Yep.
um, so yeah. Finally, the book ends with a bit of information on what you might expect with relationships of different types of others.
Yeah, I mostly just viewed this as a cool summarization of some of the broad types of others.
Yeah.
Like, I could see myself coming back to this part specifically when we meet some new other to try and figure them out. Like, like we weren't, Verona's eye friend is divine, and it's sort of like, this is the sort of thing now where I'd maybe try and come back here to see if I can figure that sort of thing out myself.
Yeah. True. Interesting. Yeah. Although I don't know, the fact that this is where our chapter ends is a little worrying to me. Like it ends on a note of making a bond with a higher power is going to fuck you up, and it feels like it's important that that's where this section ends. like it's Wildbow hinting at us something, you know?
Yeah, well, it kind of implies that anyone who does this, they're standing on the edge of a knife all the time. Like, the thing here is they're kind of like, you can get it to work, but one tiny slip up and you're fucked. And again, like, the only thing we know so far about this arc is it's got Durashay in it, and she's got her big, powerful familiar. Like, how much is she on a knife's edge, and how much are our three going to tip her off it accidentally or some shit? Like, I don't know.
Yeah, true. How careful of a balance is this that we haven't been exposed to with Durashay? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just sort of, I'm just thinking because you're right. It sort of ends on that, which is like I feel like that is meant to be the thought in our heads as we move forward. So is that's the only direction I could see it going.
Yeah, and you kind of mentioned that that's what you thought we were going to get to next, which I think makes sense given that that's how this bonus material ends. I don't know. It is odd to me that this is the bonus material we get right now, which usually means this is going to be relevant in a week or two at most.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it seems like none of the Kenneteers are like looking to get a familiar, right?
No, exactly. And that was sort of my first thought. Like when you see it's the familiar text, I'm like, wait, shit, is someone about to get a familiar? But that didn't feel
Yeah.
right. So I think instead, if we're gonna hang out with Durashay's crew more this arc, like Eloise has a familiar, Ulysses has a god, Durashay has her familiar, and all that shit. Like they just seem like a crew who's ripe to explore the dynamics that can happen
Yeah.
here. So
Yeah.
my guess at the moment would be that's where we're going.
We'll have to see next time, because we are finished with the Famulus text and with all the chapters for this week.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us, folks. Have a lovely Halloween. If you have comment, what was the discussion that we did? Oh yeah, how would you bind the Carmine Beast? If you have thoughts on that, not discussion question, leave them in our Reddit thread, or just thoughts on the episode in general. Leave them in the Reddit thread.
Should we just make it a discussion
It's official. We've got a discussion question. It's officially, how would you bind the Carmine Beast? Let's say Miss Durashay lets the Carmine Beast out of her cage and she's coming for you. How would you deal with it? What tricks, what symbology, what ideas would you use? Would you use a sympathetic or a positive or negative binding or a hallowed binding?
I think it's fun to talk about like the different kinds. Like if I needed to do a positive one, how could I do it? Also, if there's too many Carmine answers and you think it's getting boring in the thread, do the Alabaster or
pick
some
any
of the
of
other
them,
two.
any of the judges for sure. You can leave your answers to that in our discussion thread on Reddit, which will be linked in the show notes down below.
And just before people leave, we are going to be doing a Backed to Pact in a sec. So stay tuned. Those who've listened to Pact.
We're going Backed to Pact.
Yes. But back to the outro that we do before Back to Pact. We're on Twitter. I've got my new live read schedule. I'm kind of keeping to it most of the time when my power doesn't get knocked out by hailstorms. So
classic.
Go check it out.
Yep. If you want more from Doof Media, you can go to doofmedia.com, where you can find all of the great shows on the Doof Media network.
Well, a bunch of all of them, Ruben, because some of them aren't really listed there because they're patron exclusive.
Sneaky, yes, true.
So for $10 and above patrons, you get access to all of our bonus shows, including the one Ruben and I have been running called The High Ground, where we go through George Lucas's Star Wars prequel movies, everyone's favorite trilogy of films.
Yes.
In fact, in a few days after this comes out, like 2 days, we're doing a live watch of episode 2 for that show. So Ruben will be watching it for the first time. I haven't seen it for like 15 years. I barely remember what happens. Georgia will be our expert. And we're inviting all the patrons on that $10 and above tier to come and watch it with us. So if you're interested in that, come along.
Yes. As a side note, you will need to have a Disney Plus account to do that. But if you do, that's great.
Also, the time is in our public calendar. Check, because it's not a very America-friendly time, unfortunately.
Yes. It's like 3 a.m. on election morning. Good times.
We are Australian, and we did what we could, but it wasn't going to work out.
While you're on Patreon, why not head over to Wildbow's Patreon, and you can support him. Actually, supporting Wildbow helps keep him comfortable and helps him keep writing stories. It's kind of a positive binding, if you will, where you surround him with money and fiscal rewards, and he allows you to draw the power of stories out of him. So if you want to sympathetically bind Wildbow, you can do that by going to patreon.com/wildbow.
Yes, please do.
And with that,
let's get back to Pact.
let's go back to Pact. So what's on your mind, Elliot? All the pale only readers have been kicked out. See you, nerds. What's on your mind?
The big reason I really wanted to bring a Back to Pact in today was because the first few paragraphs of this fabulous excerpt in the extra material we just covered is word for word what is in 2.x of Pact. Pretty much all of chapter 1 is just word for word 2.x in Pact, which was just crazy to me because it read so fucking differently to me now than it did back then. Admittedly, part of that is because I know more about the world in general, but so much of that is just because of the framing of Pale versus Pact. You brought up there's that whole paragraph talking about the definition of familiar and how it relates to the Latin and French origins. That's in 2.x of Pact, and I think we probably probably called it out in Deep in Pact as like, oh, that's neat, like cool etymology.
We did. And it's been so long, Elliot. It's been like fucking, what has it been since we read that chapter? Probably 2 years. Is that right?
Close to 2 years. Yeah. But that's the thing, right? Is it's like we read so much more into that now just because of the framing of this story. Before we would have been like, huh, neat. Whereas now I'm like, oh, this is saying a lot about how this is viewed in the world. And it's just showing like how much even like 2 years of covering these stories later, we're still playing fucking catch up to where Wildbow was with this world 6 years ago. This chapter came out 6 years ago, and the fact that he can just pull that shit that he wrote so long ago and put it in the story now, and I'm like, oh, this changes everything, even though it's 6 years old. Like, that's insane.
It's crazy to me. Like, obviously, when we did Deep in Pact, there was like a lot of social commentary stuff in there, mostly around class, right? Which we're kind of getting back to in Pale, although I think in Pale it's a lot more on the surface. Like, it's a lot stronger as a part of the story. It's crazy to me. Like, I have the thought of like, has this stuff always worked so well in these systems? Like, it's the systems of this world so naturally lent itself to these kinds of discussions of classism, or is it something that Wildbow has just kind of expanded on and built out more as, I guess, the world got into a place where that was more necessary? But it can't be that. Like, it's just crazy how well this story and these systems support the ideas that Wildbow was exploring, even though while they were a part of Pact, it was never like hugely a part to the extent that it feels like it is now.
No, there's definitely a change in emphasis on parts of the world. Like, the rights of others is something we're considering so much more in Pale than we ever did in Pact. And that's why we're reading some of these things differently. But no, you're right, in a way that like I can go back and look at Pact and it doesn't like break it. It was a bit the same in Worm and Ward. Like, Ward felt very different in some ways and how it focused on powers and what they meant, but like, in a way that was just different to Worm, but like they was still clearly the same world, and it's the same vibe I'm getting here. Like you can go back, like, if you look at the Toronto Council Impact, because one of my first thoughts when we sort of had the others are below practitioners, like even months ago in Pale, was like, well, that wasn't true in Toronto because
in the Toronto Council, exactly. We had the Lord of Toronto who was Conquest, right?
But again, you look at it, there were 2 others probably on the council. Like, the Eye was maybe technically part of the council, but he was
more an enforcer. He wasn't really decision making, right?
He is listed as on the council though, so
yes, true.
But like, I don't see him actually voting properly or against Conquest ever. But maybe that's just me being otherist. But the only other 2 others on the council were Isadora and Conquest. Conquest was explicitly like being propped up into the position as a figurehead to protect everyone else on the council.
All the others,
like he was being put there as a shield for the predominantly human council.
Yes.
So actually, kind of more like tokenism than really him being the Lord.
Yeah, you're right.
And then Isadora's the other one. She
kind of felt a bit outside of the system to me as well,
when she kept taking girls like Paige under her wing, and I think there was a heavily implied way she'd taken them as a familiar.
Yes.
um,
Oh yeah, for sure.
aspect. And so like you get like that's just Isadora. She's just using she's being forced to have a human relationship familiar thing to sort of be elevated to that point is how I could like read that with the pale perspective.
Yeah, I mean, looking at Jacob's Bell, we did have Crone Mara, who would you call her an other? She definitely
I
seemed to be like powerful and respected, right?
yeah, I
Or in
mean
air quotes, respected, I guess. Feared,
yeah.
maybe is the correct word.
I would not have called Crone Mara human.
Yeah,
I would have labeled her as an other, but like she
yeah.
was definitely like again, she's one of those people. She was on the council, but like you know, she was like Briar Girl. They were like
Mm. They were more
prominent.
wild cards than active,
Yeah, they were
like,
prominent powers
participants.
in
Yeah.
town to the point where they just kind of were obligatorily
Yes.
included in the meetings. But like the
Yeah.
Behaims and the Duchamps and Johannas, they were running the show.
They were the ones. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's interesting. I
Yeah,
mean,
I mean,
Blake tried to change the system and made some strides. I
hmm.
guess we'll see how the Kennetiers do.
What's going to be interesting for me is seeing pale readers jump into Pact, and like they're going to be so primed to be aware of like you know the relationship between others and humans in a way I just don't think we were. Like at least when we read Pact, this was not something I think we considered that much. We generally
Well,
prescribe to others like humans or their monsters
I think it's
depending on
interesting. We had a lot of conversations at the start about the ideas of like vestiges and like, hey, are these and ghosts like June and
mm,
thinking about like, hey, is this right that they're being treated like this? And I think over the course of that story, we kind of just settled into being like, yeah, it's fine. You know, they are what they are. You
yeah,
know, which is like
they're not fully human.
explicitly, yeah, us settling into the societal norms there.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And like, yeah, then there were like others that I would sort of classify as human-like, like Isadora and
The Fae probably as
and
well.
Conquest. Yeah, but
Yeah.
like, yeah. So like for me, it's just going to be fascinating. Like, I want to something I want to try and do at the end of Pale is organize a read of Pact with people who
Mm,
hadn't read it yet.
mm,
In part because I'm just so fascinated to see their experience coming from Pale of like meeting demons who are objectively terrible others.
yeah.
And
Yeah, true. Maybe that's the difference, is we haven't really seen any others that are purely evil, evil things.
even the
Demons
goblins are,
are,
are sanitized in this.
yeah, yeah. Interesting.
But yeah, like
Interesting how that
it'll just
changes your perspective.
it'll be interesting to see people in Pact, or people who've read Pale when they read Pact, when they meet something like the hyena, or they see something like Johannes's domain, like what how their reactions will differ. And
Mm,
like originally, part of my plan for that was also getting those people to listen to Deep Impact as they were reading Pact. Now I almost don't want them to do that because I feel like what we say in Deep Impact will seem so bizarre to someone who's read Pale because they'll know so much more about the world. They'll have such a different perspective on the relationship between others and humans. Like I almost feel like there won't be as much value in something like Deep Impact for them.
yeah, yeah. Interesting. Interesting. Anything else we want to dive into from Pact to as we are going back to Pact?
Um, just like a comment, I suppose, on how neat it is for something like this fabulous text that we just got. Like how much fun it was during my live read to apply some of these relationships that are described to uh people in Pact.
Yeah.
I think it is fun for us Pact readers to see some of these that like are theoretical to Pale only readers, but we can be like, oh, you know, like there's the collapsed or failed familiar relationship where the other is completely in charge, and I was sort of like,
Mm,
I wonder if that's what Briar Girl is seen as. You know,
mm.
like for a pale person, it's theoretical. For us, we're sort of like, well, that's probably how Briar Girl would be labeled, even though I don't know if that's fair. I actually think Briar Girl was more cognizant of that relationship
Yes.
and where it was, and more
Yes.
consenting than a lot of the others gave her credit for.
Yeah, I agree.
It was like the
Yeah.
Rose seniors and the Duchamps were like, "Oh, she must have been tricked and taken over. That's the only way this could happen." Whereas whenever we met her, she was just kind of like,
She
"I hate."
seemed happy with the arrangement.
Yeah,
Yeah.
she always seemed like, "Oh, I hate civilization," and that could be the familiar instilling that
Yes.
instinct to her. So we don't know,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
I was usually tempted to just take it at face value and assume that was actually her.
Yeah.
It was just unfathomable to the other practitioners in town that she would be okay with this. We never found out who her secret teacher was.
Her secret tutor, no.
Yeah.
Maybe it was Alexander.
Durachet.
Yeah. Cool. Anything else from Pact that we want to touch on?
No, I feel like every now and then there's like little snippets that make me want to say something about Pact in this, but not enough to warrant a whole segment. And now I've forgotten them all, so they're lost to the ether.
All right. Well, I guess that's that then. Thanks for joining us, folks. Have a happy Halloween.